Bum, 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 bum. Hello, welcome to another Inner Hour. Thank you for joining us tonight. I appreciate it. And let's see here. Alrighty. Just checking in case there's any people who haven't been here before, kind of fill you in on how it works, but you're all old hats at this, so you know how it works. I'm going to light a candle to start with. If you haven't done so at your end, you can light a candle, but if you haven't taken a moment to give yourself space to enter into the spirit of the next hour, letting go of the things of the day and of the week, and just gathering your attention back to that quiet place inside where the light of your soul vibrates all the time, and begin to pay more attention to that in the next hour than things going on in your body or things going on in the world around you. Shabbat. Alrighty. So, this is making myself a note of something I want to make sure to announce at the end. So these are, again, a collection of readings, fairly short ones on a theme, biblical readings on a theme. These happen to be actually all from the New Testament. It wasn't intentional, I just realized they were. So the theme, we've done a similar theme a while back, but this theme is freedom. And so this is, the first reading is from 2 Corinthians. Again, a little background. Corinth was a city back then, fairly good-sized city back then. And there was a gathering of what later became called Christians, but were at the time were people in the Jesus movement, which actually was known as the Way, W-A-Y, back then, because he was teaching a way of living, a way to know God, a way to enter into oneness or communion with God. And later on they became called Christians, but the word Christ itself is Greek. Well, it's English, but the original was Christos, which is Greek. And so the idea of Christians is not even a Hebrew concept or word, but that was later on. So there was a group of Yeshua or Jesus followers, part of that larger body of the movement, that had mostly been introduced to his teachings through Paul. And speaking of freedom, Paul, because he was not only Jewish by birth, but was a Roman citizen, he had access to travel the empire with safe passage as a Roman citizen under the protection of Rome. And so he did. He did extensive traveling ministries, which the Jewish apostles of Jesus did not. They did most of them did much more limited ones. And another quick background on Paul, even though many of these writings are from Paul, to the best of our knowledge, historically, Paul never met Jesus in the flesh. We don't know for sure that he didn't either, but he never wrote about it, and no one else ever wrote about it that we've ever found, so it's pretty unlikely given his prominence. He came upon the scene when Yeshua already had an active ministry going in Israel to the Jews. His original ministry was to Jews, not to Gentiles. In fact, he initially forbade his 12 Jewish apostle men from going into Gentile territory or taking this to the Gentiles. It was just for the Jews originally. And long story that covers hundreds of years of change, but basically Paul um, thought that Yeshua was a false prophet and that he was subverting the laws of Moses and teaching people to abandon the Torah, which was exactly the opposite. He wasn't doing any of that. But that's what Paul felt because he didn't understand what Yeshua was teaching. So Paul, whose name was Saul at the time, had an active campaign against any followers of Jesus. And because of his Roman connections and authority, he would get writs of arrest throughout the kingdom, wherever he found these little pockets of Jewish believers in Jesus, and would have them arrested. And often that meant not only being imprisoned for a long time or forever, but sometimes put to death and often tortured. And then he had this inner experience where he beheld this great light, which blinded him for several days, physically blinded him for several days. And in that light, he heard a voice speak to him, asking him, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he took that voice to be Yeshua, because that's the only one he was really persecuting. And so he was converted and became a believer in Yeshua and his teachings. But his understanding of what Yeshua was teaching and who Yeshua thought he was quite significantly different than what Jesus and those who knew him and worked with him and were ordained by him as apostles. A very different take on the teachings, on the mission itself, on who Jesus was proclaiming himself to be and who he wasn't proclaiming himself to be. And throughout the New Testament and also outside the New Testament, in many letters we have, the original apostles and Paul did not get along, and their teachings were not congruent, and there was a lot of friction between them. That's all a very long story that doesn't fit into tonight, but it's a bit of background. So Paul's the writer of some of these quotes that I'm going to read to you. I'll tell you if it's not. And he's writing to small communities of people who are trying to follow and or learn the teachings of Yeshua, who are at distance from Israel, from Galilee or the Jerusalem area, either one. Like in Corinth, or like in Tarsus, or like in Rome, or different places, Galatia. Anyway, and again, just a bit of historical background. Literacy at the time in this population was very rare. So most people who wrote letters, which most people didn't, but people who wrote letters often had to have scribes write down what they were saying because they couldn't write it themselves, and then send it to a community of people who would find someone in their community who could read it, who would then read it aloud to the community at a community gathering. So that's kind of how this process worked. And that's what these are. These are letters Paul wrote, usually through a scribe, although he himself was literate. But often he wrote them through a scribe anyway, and would send them to these communities who would have someone in their community who was literate read that at a community gathering. So that's kind of the background on these letters that we have in the New Testament. So this is from the second letter that Paul wrote to the group in Corinth, and consequently it's known as 2 Corinthians, and it's chapter 3, verse 18. And it says, "We now, with unveiled faces, look as if in a mirror at the glory of the Lord. And as we look at him, we are being transformed into that same image and same glory, the same Spirit." Again, I'll talk about all these a little more in depth. This is also from that second letter to Corinthians, also from chapter 3, but it starts at verse 17. Whenever someone turns away from the Lord, whenever someone turns away from the world and turns toward the Lord, the veil over their eyes is taken away. Because the Lord is Spirit. He's not even saying the Lord is Jesus here. And this is Paul writing, who's all about Jesus. Because the Lord is Spirit. And wherever the Spirit is, there is freedom. So that's another from the same section of that letter. Also from this same letter, but this is now chapter 5. Therefore, if anyone is in the Spirit of Christ, that person becomes a new creation, and the old things in them all pass away, and new things come. All these things are from God, who has reconciled us to himself, and then entrusted to us a ministry of reconciliation, namely, that just as God reconciled the world to himself, he has committed to us the work of reconciling the world to one another. Therefore, we consider ourselves as ambassadors for Christ, as if God is making an appeal through us. And so we beg you, on behalf of God, be reconciled to God and to one another. Now, this next one is not from Paul. One of Yeshua's primary disciples, one of his key figures, to whom he entrusted passing on, one of whom he entrusted passing on his work after his own death, was a man that in the Christian Bible is called Peter, or Simon Peter. His name was not Peter, and Peter is not a Hebrew name. His name was Simon in Hebrew, and or sometimes Shimon. But and Peter actually is a version that derives from the Greek word Cephas, which means rock, because he considered Simon, who was known as Peter or the Rock, to be the rock of his 12 apostles, the most solid one that everyone else in that group leaned on. So Peter also writes to various communities of believers. And in this particular letter, one of the things he's writing against is being careful about who you follow as a teacher. And he has a great deal to say about that, but I'm just going to quote one part that relates to freedom. And the they that he's going to refer to in this passage are teachers that Simon considered to be false teachers, or at least mistaken teachers, ones that he was warning people not to emulate or follow. And Peter said, such as these promise freedom to you, while they themselves remain slaves to corruption. For by what anyone is overcome and yields to, by that he has been enslaved. Beware of such teachers. So, again, comments afterwards. This is back to a Paul letter to a group in Galatia called, this is the Galatians, it's 5th chapter of that letter. It was for freedom that the Christ came and set us free. Therefore stand firm and do not submit yourself ever again to a yoke of slavery. By the way, few of the people that were being addressed here were actually slaves in the literal sense. It's possible there were some in the community, but the majority of them were free men and Jews. But the enslavement that's being talked about here is not physical bondage. It's an inner spiritual enslavement, if you will, or emotional enslavement to things like fear or intimidation or ego or all the things we still deal with. All right. Going on. This is also from Paul to a group in Rome. So it's called the letter to the Romans. This is the 8th chapter, 21st verse. And he's talking about this same freedom, this idea of getting spiritually free. And in this, he takes it even further than talking about individuals getting free by following what Yeshua taught, or even communities getting free by what Yeshua taught. He's talking about something on a much grander scale. And so what he says is that through this process of spiritual freedom and awakening in individuals and communities, through this process, the entire creation itself will be set free from its corruption and its slavery, and once again become the free children of God. So that's a much bigger picture. Excuse me. And the last one I'll share is from James. So let me tell you about James just for a moment. James is an English name for the Hebrew name Yaakov. And Yaakov was a very common Hebrew name at that time in that part of the world. So there are lots of them in the Bible at large, the Jewish Bible, and also in the New Testament portion of the Christian Bible. And there were two prominent James in the ministry of Yeshua. One was known as James, the son of Alphaeus, and he was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, and was, by many accounts, a blood cousin of Jesus, as were many of the apostles, actually. And there's another James, and this letter is written by the other James. This other James was the blood brother of Jesus, Yeshua's actual family blood brother. Now, whether he was a child of Mary and Joseph, or whether he was a stepchild of Mary's and a son of Joseph by a previous marriage, there's all kinds of historical argument about that, based primarily on whether you believe Mary was a virgin all her life or not, but that's another issue. But anyway, he was definitely the child raised by Mary and Joseph, and was a brother, step or full, to Yeshua. And he writes a great deal of things that are quite different than Paul, including he writes kind of an opposition piece to Paul in the first part of this letter. I'm not going to read that because it doesn't relate to this, but where he takes a direct stand against something Paul was teaching at the time. So this part, though, is about freedom again, so it relates to our theme. One last piece. The word law here is from the English version of the Bible. Whenever you see in the Hebrew Bible the word Torah, it is almost always in English versions translated as law, even though there is a Hebrew word that literally means law, which is not Torah. Torah more literally, in its original meaning, meant teaching or instructions. So the Torah is a body of teachings and instructions, not primarily looked at originally as laws, although there were sections, particularly Leviticus, that has lots of laws and civil laws and religious laws and guidelines and whatnot in it. But and even other parts of Exodus and various books have some of that, like the Ten Commandments, but also not called commandments in Judaism. Anyway, so when we hear the word law in this, you might substitute the word teaching or instruction. So this is James writing and says, the brother of Jesus, when one looks intently at the perfect law or perfect teachings, the teachings of freedom, and continues in those teachings, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an active and consistent doer, that person will be blessed in everything he does. So those are some takes on this freedom theme in the New Testament. And I'll go back and share a little bit about each of them briefly. The unveiled faces is something that is a reference used a lot, oh, I shouldn't say a lot, is used here and there in the New Testament. And it refers back to Moses in the Jewish Bible. When Moses came down from his encounters with Hashem, with Adonai, with the Lord, with God, on Mount Sinai, and eventually, brought down the teachings or the Torah. When he came down, he was, I've mentioned this before, was so radiant, physically radiant, that people couldn't look upon him, and they asked him to put a veil over his face because he was too bright to look at. So in the New Testament, several writers mentioned that and talk about unveiled faces. So in the first one where it says, we with unveiled faces, does not in this case mean what we might think of like taking the spiritual illusions off or taking the blinders off. Does not mean that at all in this passage. It means we've seen and are now radiant with that same light. And so we're becoming transformed into that same image or same light as God. That the Spirit is transforming us into that image as we look upon it. So that's the reference there. And then again in the next passage, whenever someone turns to the Lord and looks upon him, the veil is taken away. Certainly can mean in that sense that their blinders, their spiritual blindness can be taken away. And can also refer back to that other passage of they become more radiant because what they're allowing to move through them is not their own ego and personality, but this radiant spirit. And then again in the next passage about becoming a new person in Christ, that the old things pass away and new ones have come. I think probably all of you, I hope, have had the experience of ways you used to identify yourself, you don't anymore. Things you used to identify yourself with, you don't anymore. At least, in some cases. Things you used to do, some of them, you don't do anymore. And things you never did, or did rarely, you do much more often now. You spend much more time in your spiritual focus than you do in your worldly focus. And probably before, it was the other way around. And it's also the passage that he talks about the work of reconciliation and that God has entrusted us. Now, in that case, it may mean just apostles, but since they're writing to the community, it probably doesn't. It probably means everybody, that God has entrusted the work of reconciliation to all of us, that we are to help one another be reconciled to God and to help each other reconcile with one another, and that that's an important part of the spiritual work. And you see that theme again fairly frequently in the New Testament, which attests to the fact that Christianity was what became Christianity, which was a Jewish movement initially, kind of a Jewish renewal movement actually, in the Judaism of the time, that in that movement, it was never seen as a solitary thing. Spirituality was not locking yourself away in a closet somewhere and doing your own meditation practice and then that was it. It was always seen as connecting to and involving the community as well. And then Peter's warning about not being fooled by teachers that promise you they can bring you to freedom and deliver you while they themselves are still slave to their own emotions and their own reactiveness and their own egos and their own, all the things that trouble all of us, that weigh us all down. It's not that we should expect our teachers to not be human or to not have failings or frailty, because they all do and all will, and certainly including me, by the way. But we should be wary of teachers that proclaim they've arrived and they've done it, and they're perfected in it. Not just that they've reached these heightened states, because many of them really have, and many of you have, but that they have sustained these states to the point that they represent themselves as being that, as being emissaries of that all the time, and that they've overcome, if you will, their humanness. So when that kind of a proclamation is available, whether it's in ancient times or in present, the advice here in Peter is be careful, because how do you expect someone to liberate you from things that you're in bondage to when the one saying they're going to liberate you is in the same kind of bondage you are to the same things, and you see it over and over in the way they live? So be careful. And, or the way Yeshua put it was, the fruit never falls far from the tree. So if you want to know, you know, watch the fruits of a person's life. Watch how they live, not just what they say, or not even what they profess to believe, but watch what they do. Watch how they live. I think it's good advice for all of us all the time, and not just in the spiritual arena. Life in general. So, and then Galatians kind of echoes that same theme about you've been set free. Don't submit again to the yoke of slavery. And again, it's really not talking about physical enslavement, like slaves before the Civil War here, or slaves in Africa, or slaves in China. There've been slaves. I don't know of a country that hasn't had slaves at some time in its history. But that inner enslavement that we do to ourselves, or the emotional enslavement we allow others to do to us, to hold us in an emotional subjectivity, where we're so afraid either physically of harm from the person, or of their emotional backlash, or of their judgment against us, that we're not willing to stand up for ourselves, that we just cave and allow ourselves to be used and or abused in some way, not necessarily physically. That I believe would be a legitimate thing that they're talking about here too, is in terms of don't submit to that. And then about the whole creation being freed, there, in the many of the Jewish ancient midrash and stories and ancient Kabbalistic writings, there's a concept that, unlike in some of the Eastern writings, that everything's perfect just as it is and the world is perfect. There's a recognition in much of Jewish history and writings that in fact the world is not perfect, and that it's damaged or broken. Broken is a word that's often used. That things here have been shattered, including people's hearts, and that part of our work is that restoration or reconciliation, where we're brought back from that fragmented, broken state, back into a state of wholeness within ourselves, which then enables us to be able to begin to move into that greater divine oneness with all life and the source of life, God, the Lord, Spirit, in whatever name you want to attach to that, because it in itself is beyond concept and beyond language and beyond naming. So, and then the last piece with James is that this perfect teaching, or this perfect law of freedom, will set us free if we're consistent, active doers of it. Not just if we listen to it from time to time and get inspired and get hopeful and think, oh, that sounds really nice, I like that, I feel better. But it doesn't really transform us, and it doesn't change the way we think, and it doesn't change the way we speak, and it doesn't change the way we live, and it doesn't change the way we relate to people out here, and it doesn't change the way we relate to ourselves in here, or the energies we carry in here, or the way we relate to the divine in here. Unless the spiritual teaching reaches deep enough in us to make those transformations, then we're missing the full value of them. Because that's what it is really means to do the inner work, is to allow the Spirit deep enough into your consciousness and being and bodies to actually transform you into who you are and who you were created to be, but whom you've forgotten and whom you've put lots and lots of veils and masks and garments over, to the point that you and others can barely see that in you anymore. To allow it to do that deep transformative work, not just to believe something differently with your intellect, not just to maybe not say things you really wish you could say, but you can at least restrain yourself from saying them, but you still carry all that judgmental energy or anger or hostility inside. But to allow that deep work to be done in you by the power of that living Spirit, that's really what, from my perspective, is meant when spiritual teachers throughout the ages have talked about this is an inner process. It is an inner process, and for it to be completed, it must be anchored inside and allow that to happen. But then there's also a transformation in the way you live outwardly, and the kind of life you live, and what you do and are able to do in the world too. That's also transformed. Because one of the very ancient teachings, this kind of goes back to what I said about Yeshua and watching the fruit. One of the really, really old teachings in many cultures, particularly Mideastern teachings and particularly Eastern teachings, is that inner realization is recognized by outer demonstration. So when we see people being patient in frustrating situations, when we see people willing to endure failure after failure and not give up hope, when we see people believing in others, when we see people sacrificing their own comfort for others, when we see people standing up for what's true when it's not popular and could create social or economic or even physical danger problems for them, when we see people living a life of loving kindness, particularly if that's not the way they were living before, when we see those things outwardly, can see them happening, that's a demonstration that there's been an inner awakening, an inner transformation, inner realization. When we hear people speak of how much they've awakened and how much they've had this inner realization, and yet we see them doing the same behaviors they've always done, lashing out the way they've always lashed out, speaking the way they've always spoken, carrying the same judgments they've always carried, acting the same way they've always acted, then it might be wise to pause and not take their proclamation of realization at face value. And as a reminder to all of us, if we happen to be called to a position in the community where we're looked to for some kind of commentary or teaching or service work, whatever that might be, if we're doing any kind of that service work, socially, spiritually, whatever that might be, and not all of us are called for that kind of service, we can all do personal service, but if we're in those positions, it's a reminder for us to be also really careful about how we represent ourselves, and not try to claim something we haven't achieved or be something we're not. One last comment, and we'll go into the meditation. I've talked a lot, sorry, but one last comment I think is pertinent. There's a tradition in India, northern India. It's a spiritual tradition, and in that tradition they have a guru, and many successor gurus that move on down the line. And that tradition still exists, and there's still a living guru in that tradition. And by his own people, by his own initiates, by his own disciples, by his own following, he's considered to be, and I mean this literally, I'm not saying I say this, but his disciples, many of them, literally consider him to be God in flesh, like an incarnation or an avatar. And I've was sitting in a satsang with this guru at one time as an audience member, and there were a lot of English people and Eastern people there as well. It was done in the United States. And at this, and he has question and answer sessions. And at this question and answer, um, one of his disciples got up and asked him in front of this whole gathering of about 2,000 people, I guess. Um, Master, I have so many things I struggle with, and I have all these emotions that seem to pull me down, and I sometimes get past them, and sometimes I can't, and I have all these worries financially. And in the course of this, she went into some direction, but in the course of this, she said, I know that may be difficult for you to understand being who you are, but it's really difficult for me. And what advice can you give me for working with that? And the first thing he said in answer was, just, wait, sister, I need to clarify something for you. Because he calls everybody brother or sister. He said, wait, sister, you need to understand that anybody in a human body, including me, is a struggling soul. None of us are beyond that. So I thought that was a really interesting thing from somebody in his own group proclaiming that he isn't what has kind of been put upon that role, and acknowledging that there are lots of things he struggled with as well. And again, the fact that a teacher struggles with something does not mean they can't help you. It's uh, it's the claiming beyond where we are that can get us in trouble with ourselves and in trouble, you know, giving people false hope and misleading them. So it's a good way to be careful in general, I think. Um, so with that, we're going to move our attention inside. And I know as we bring our attention inside, the tendency that we all need to pay attention to is to watch which energy is stepping forward and speaking most loudly through us. Are we giving voice primarily to the fears in us? And in that process, not just acknowledging them, but I mean giving voice to that, being a spokesperson for fear, and therefore frightening others, not talking about the fear we experience and how we're trying to cope with it, not acknowledging that, but promoting it because we live in so much of it, and therefore frightening others. Is that the voice we stand for? Or can we allow that to step back and a higher voice work through us more often? Is my ego the voice that's speaking through me? Am I trying to convince everybody how great I am and how I know more than you do and more than somebody else does, and you should listen to me, not them? Am I trying to impress you so that I get your approval and acceptance and love because I really want that and don't know how to go about it, so I try to convince you I'm something special with my words or my music or my whatever it is, whatever you might try to convince somebody with? There are many aspects to us and many voices that would like to speak through us. So one of the ways of attaining this freedom that we're all looking at, that I'm trying to help us move into in this meditation, is a quieter voice of assurance, a place of peace in us that recognizes this is an unfolding reality. The living spirit is an unfolding spirit in me, no matter how much it's unfolded or how little it's unfolded. And it's an unfolding spirit in you. It's not a completed work. It's not an achievement. It's not a badge of honor. It's a growing into greater awareness and therefore greater ability to be kind. greater ability to be understanding, greater willingness to make the effort, even when it's hard. So that voice is the genuine voice. That's the voice of Spirit in us, teaching each of us about who we really are designed to be when we first came forth from God. Teaching each of us how to remember that and how to begin to embody it so that we live who we are instead of a self-made image, or instead of the image the world put upon us and says, well, be this, you should be this. Let all of that fall by the wayside and hear that single real voice. And allow the peace of that voice to permeate your heart. And the love of that voice heal you. And the joy of that voice enliven your life. To me, that's what the great teachers have promised us. So in the silence for a few minutes, let's invite that voice. Let's turn to that source in us. And let everything else just slowly fall away. It is the voice of our freedom and the freedom of all the children of God. So we just begin to slowly bring our attention back once more. I was just inspired to share a song with you that I wrote many years ago. We'll see if I can still do it. But it was called Give Us Wings, and it was about freedom. It was something I wrote for and did actually at a Holocaust memorial program, as I recall, at a school. But anyway, so this is it. I'm going to back up a little bit. Here we go. Each of us has a different face, a different faith, a different name, a different destiny. In each heart lives a secret hope to be set free again and overcome every tyranny and learn to live in peace. Let us start, young and old alike, to open up our hearts and work for brotherhood. Find some good in everyone, in every faith, in everything that God has made. Let Him light our way and give our freedom wings. Come forth, radiant white dove, come forth and bless us with your love. Let us see you in everything we do. Let us know you in all that we go through. Holy, holy, holy. Go forth, radiant white dove, go forth and bless all those who love. Let them see you in everything they do. Let them know you in all that they go through. Freedom, 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 freedom. Give us wings. So, may this be a week of embracing that freedom and standing for it and helping others to stand into it. Two little announcements before we close tonight. And one is a reminder that next Friday will be the first Friday of the month again. So it will not be this format. It will be the interactive format, where I start with a short prayer, introduce a topic or a question, and then open it up so the whole group, hopefully, most of you at least, can turn on cameras and microphones, and we can have a group discussion and interact with one another, where we can share our own wisdom, our own experiences, and our questions with the group. It's not just me answering your questions. I think all of you have done that before. But anyway, it's a group participatory interaction. So it's usually pretty lively, and I find it very insightful almost every time. So you're welcome to join us for that next week. And then the second announcement is tonight's inner hour will not be the last inner hour, but it will be the last inner hour done under the auspices of Inner Light Ministries. Starting next Friday, this same program, the Inner Hour program, will be done under the one by one banner. That's not the right word, but anyway, it'll be a one by one program, not an ILM program, starting next week. And consequently, I'm pretty sure that everybody who's on the list now will still be on the list. If any of you happen to miss the reminder announcement, then get a hold of us. But shouldn't be any problem on your end or any real difference on your end. The difference will be that you will normally get these inner hour invitations and reminders on Tuesdays with the link, and you get those from Stephen McAfee at ilm.org. So it will not come from that next week. It'll come from one by one community at Gmail. So if you don't get our stuff, I think you all do, but if you don't get the one by one stuff, you might want to check your spam folder just in case if your email provider is not used to seeing things group mailings come to you from one by one. That's how this will be sent out from now on. And the other thing I guess there's actually three. The other thing that's related to that, so that you're aware of it, I've mentioned before that this being a recurring program, the link you had for the inner hours in 2024 so far, including tonight, would have been the same all the way through the year, till the end of the year. However, because I will no longer be using Inner Light's Zoom account to do these programs, I'll be using one by one's Zoom account to do these. It won't be the same link. So the link you use tonight will not be good anymore. So next Tuesday when I send out the link, and it'll be in the letter explaining this too, but when I send out the link next Tuesday, which will come from one by one, because it's going to be on one by one's Zoom account, which is a different account, it'll be a different link. And then that link, the one you get next week, that link will be good for all of the rest of the programs through 2024. And you can just use that same link, but I'll continue to send them out on Tuesdays as we always have. So really not anything's going to change on your end except where it's coming from, and remember to use the new link, not the old one. So that's, I guess that's that. And we've done the inner hour since we lost our employment in July of 2022 as a volunteer service for ILM up to now. But that's going to be, as of next week, rolled into the one by one things we're doing too. So anyway, that's that. If any of that's not clear, you're welcome to reach out to us. But that's just a logistical, I guess, change. So that's it for tonight, and we wrapped up on time. Yay for us! Thank you all for joining these, and I certainly hope that the inner hour continues to be something that, because nothing's going to change in its nature. Hopefully, something you continue to want to support and that you find value in, and that we'll still see you all on Friday nights. And there may be some new people joining us, possibly because they who weren't involved in ILM and are gradually finding out about this because it's not a program they ever knew about. So there may be some new people joining us as well, or not, but the invitation will go out to them as well. So, alrighty, I think that's it. Love you all. May it be a week of greater inner and outer freedom for you, and greater peace for all of us, and for our poor suffering world that is still struggling so hard. May this week bring an ease of suffering in as many places as possible. And may we each do our part in that, however little it may seem. So, thank you all. God bless. Good night. See some of you this weekend, and some of you next week again, I hope. All right. Bye-bye. Love you.